talk about stretching comfort blankets. I'm not used to being on this side of the auditorium. So I was going to give an introduction to Gosforth's wild web, but I think Parry, in her lovely 1829 talk, said it best about the importance of encouraging people to notice nature. And as Claire says, that is really at the heart of this project, however they choose to do it, whether that is by sharing wildlife sightings and taking part in citizen science like we'll focus on today, or by celebrating nature through art or writing, or actively engaging others by leading events. And I hope some of you in the auditorium today have taken part so far. I know a few of you have, but hopefully by the end of this we'll have inspired you to go out and look at those grotty urban habitats in the city that so often we walk past and ignore. So first, just a massive thank you, and we really, really mean that. We're just over a year into Gosforth's Wild Web so far, but already you and other local people have shared 30,000 wildlife sightings across the 100 squares at the heart of the project, which you can see here with Gosforth Nature Reserve almost at the centre. And those records have come from 187 people so far, but we need to bear in mind that many more have engaged by coming along on surveys and walks. And we have had it fresh off the press from our friends at Eric North East that wildlife recording in Newcastle has increased drastically in the last 12 months. So I think you can all give yourselves a pat on the back for that. Looking past the number of records, 2,200 species within urban habitats in Newcastle and parts of North Tyneside. That includes, as you'll hear about soon, everything from fungi and flowers to mammals, birds, even the odd fish too. But why does all that matter? Well, so we're big fans of citizen science at NHSN. It's very much in our DNA. You won't hear us not go on about it, actually, but that's because it is very important. Firstly, the sightings shared by people like you help us monitor change in the countryside and in our cities as new species arrive, as native species decline, and as our changes to the landscape begin to have an effect on wildlife populations. Linking to this, they also inform conservation. They show the state of our wildlife and often the health of our wild places, linking to the tendency of wildlife recorders to highlight really valuable habitats. And I've used Gosforth Nature Reserve here because it is officially the most recorded place in northeast England at present. So perhaps we need to persuade people to go outside of the reserve for once, which you never thought you'd hear me say in a speech about GNR's centenary. But important too is that the sightings shared, whether online or through events and talks, inspire others. And providing those experiences has the potential to trigger a chain reaction, shall we say, where people engage and enjoy wildlife in the future. And that to me is very important. So this looks rather daunting. You don't need to pay too much attention to it, but this effectively shows you what happens to your wildlife sightings when they're sent in. But the important thing to take home from this is these logos at the side, in that eventually, after several people have looked at them and verified and argued over whether your lichen is the right one, they make their way to the people that matter, to landowners, to NGOs, to local authorities, people with the power to make a difference for wildlife. And that seems like a very good just cause. And you can do all of that and make a massive difference by simply sharing what you see. And that doesn't need to be on an expert survey. It can be on your walk to work, whilst you're taking the kids to school. And this quote here from David Attenborough really does say nice things about the value of citizen science. So with that, I'm going to hand you across to NHSN's shiny new urban naturalist, Ellie Davison, who's going to talk to you about fungi.
Right, so I might be biased, but I think fungi are absolutely fascinating, hence the themed dressing today. They represent a huge portion of the world's biodiversity, and in fact, a 2023 estimate from Kew put them at about 3 million species, which puts them behind only invertebrates, so sorry, James, but we do win there. Despite being everywhere, from the soil to the trees to us, Fungi often go unnoticed because they spend most of or all of their lives underneath the substrate they're growing on. But if you take the time to stop and look, especially at this time of year, which is the best time of year, you'll start to see them popping up everywhere. You've got corals, you've got brackets, rusts and crusts, each with a unique role in the ecosystem. So unfortunately, fungi are massively under-recorded, which makes it really difficult to track changes, especially in the sort of massive climate and biodiversity crisis we're currently facing. So that's why citizen science becomes really crucial. So stuff like Gosforth Nature Reserve is just amazing. A great hub to have in the wild web is just such an important thing to have in this area. Oh, very nice. So, since I'm based at GNR, I thought I'd start there. So I've had the pleasure of exploring Gosforth Nature Reserve a little bit since I started 3 weeks ago today. It's a really good hub for fungi because it's got a real mix of different woodland types. You've got birch, you've got oak, beech, wet willow, and it's also SSSI for its deadwood. So it is absolutely brilliant. Some of the highlights I've found so far are the fly agaric, the classic sort of toadstool, fairy tale. Those ones were the side of dinner plates, which is pretty amazing. Amethyst deceiver, that purple one down there, is always just a lovely little pop of colour at this time of year. The very impressive hen of the woods, top left, I found out that is also, it grows in Japan as well, and the Japanese word for it, I'm not going to try and pronounce it because I'll butcher it, but it translates as the jumping mushroom because people jump for joy when they see it because it's so amazing. Not shown here as well are the oak mazegill, which is just absolutely beautiful. Gets its name from the beautiful labyrinth pattern the gills make. And so many milk caps and rustlers, which I cannot identify to species, but they are amazing. So zooming out a little bit towards the whole of the Gosforth Wild Web. So we have all sorts of fungi here. Really excitingly, we have 421 fungi observations on our naturalists alone, which covers 133 species. And on iRecord, we'll have even more, which is 972 observations, which covers 300 species. So for fungi, which is really under-recorded, that is absolutely fantastic. And, you know, we're not even finished yet, so it's only going to get better. Some of the standout fungi from here, I mean, chicken of the woods, you've probably heard of it, you might have eaten it. Very, very popular, edible around there. White saddle, which is at the top row there, which I just think looks so weird and wonderful. It just sort of reminds me of how massively diverse this kingdom is. Common earth balls and green elf cup, just classic species. Parry mentioned the elf cup, that's the mushroom, the staining that she saw as well. Penny bun, also known as the king of the mushrooms because it is so highly prized. And wax caps. So we've had loads of wax caps observations come through, which is really exciting because they're indicators of good quality grassland, unimproved grassland, which I will be touching on later. But the two here are parrot wax cap and blackening wax cap up there, also known as the witch's hat, which is quite fitting this time of year. And we've also had a few species of earth stars right at the bottom there, which I will be talking about in the next slide. So, earth stars. Earth stars are some of the coolest fungi around. So we've got 18 species in the UK, and they belong to a group called the gastromycetes, if I pronounce that right, which is also known as the stomach fungi, because their fruiting bodies are supposed to be a sort of stomach-shaped sac. I'm not sure if I say that, but that's what they're supposed to look like, filled with dry spores. Young earth stars come up looking a little bit like little mushrooms. Sorry, they are little mushrooms. Little onions coming up. And what makes them really, really fascinating is that they can actually move. So those little rays that come out, they fold over and push themselves up, and they can actually pop themselves off the main mycelium and then blown around and help disperse the spores further than they would do otherwise. So we have several species of earth stars on our iNaturalist and iRecord projects, but as they can be pretty difficult to ID to species, the North East Fungus Study Group were very kind and gave me their records. that I could share. So we'll have the striated earth star, which is pretty under-recorded, or rare, probably both, but it's really easy to miss because it blends in so well with the leaf litter on the floor. So called because of the striations around the opening at the top. We have the collared earth star, which is so called because of the collar. That one's our biggest and one of the most common as well. We've got the fringed earth star, which is also fairly common as well. And then you've got, very excitingly, the hygroscopic earth star, which isn't a true earth star. It's really unusual. So what it does is very cool. I don't quite understand it, but it reacts to moisture levels in the environment. So if it's really dry, it'll shrivel back up and sort of bring those rays back up and hide itself from slugs or other predators. And then once the rain comes, it then opens itself out and allows the spores to disperse again. So that was really unusual, and it's not been recorded in Scotland at all. It's much more common in the south than it is up here. So that was a fantastic spot by those guys. And thank you for sharing the records with me. Wax caps. So these are wax caps in the actual wild web. So they are fungi of unimproved grasslands, which are nutrient poor, often grazed by sheep or cattle, although graveyards are also really good for wax caps as well. So as you can imagine, these sort of long-term landscapes are increasingly rare through ploughing or agricultural intensification or urban sprawl. Wax caps come in an amazing array of colours. As you can see, you've got greens, blues, pinks, and are really some of those striking fungi that you can actually find out and about, I think. But yeah, we've had some amazing records, as you can see. Parrot wax caps are probably our most common one, right in the middle there. They are quite variable in colour, but will often have that sort of greenish tinge to them. So, great example there. Thank you, Chris Barlow, for here tonight. And yeah, the sort of main hot spots for wax caps that we've found through our records in this project so far have been Havana Nature Reserve, Big Waters, Triple SI, and Rising Sun Country Bar as well. And I just wanted to mention a little shout out for wax caps of the North East. So zooming out a little bit to Hadrian's Wall. So this is an internationally important site along Hadrian's Wall, which is just a stone's throw away. And the North East Fungus Study Group did a foray here recently, and they found 27 species of wax caps and 18 species of pink gills. And a really notable wax cap that they found here is called the butterscotch wax cap, which was only described in 2013 based on 2 collections in Wales. And since then, it's only been found in 2 other spots in England. So pretty cool, and just down the road. Finally, I just want to sort of talk about why citizen science is so important for fungi especially. So it's a much more understood kingdom than plants or animals. We really do lack that baseline data to track any sort of changes. So, like I say, we're in the middle of a climate crisis, biodiversity crisis. We're all very aware of that now. But if we don't know what's there, we don't know what we're going to lose. And I just wanted to also give a shout out to this amazing fungus that the North East Fungus Study Group found recently in Havana Nature Reserve. So this is the scarlet berry truffle, which is from New Zealand, and obviously a very striking mushroom, but was first recorded in the UK in 1973, probably introduced through like exotic plant species, and is now being spread through probably birds eating and excreting. But it's still really rare, with only about 30 to 40 records officially on the fungal records database of Britain and Ireland, and now we have it in Havana, which is just amazing. It seems to be naturalised as well, not particularly invasive or anything, but it's just really interesting that this sort of citizen science is allowing us to track these changes in species distribution. But in conclusion, fungi are all around us, and projects like Gosforth's Wild Web give us the sort of chance to uncover and record their incredible diversity. So next time you're out and about, keep your eyes on the ground, keep your eyes on the trees, see what's out there, and record. Whether it's spot on earth stars, wax caps, rusts, crusts, amazing scarlet berry truffles. Every observation adds to our understanding, so let's keep exploring and sharing, and who knows what we'll find next. So, thank you. I would like to introduce now our invertebrate coordinator, Ben Hawthorne.
Well, thank you, Ellie. Yeah, fungi are quite fascinating, aren't they? So hopefully I can excite you just as much for the invertebrates. My name is Ben Hawthorne. I am the invertebrate coordinator with Gordon and Charlotte Rankin, and I'm also a PhD student here. I'm in the final year of my PhD, and my project is looking at how invertebrates respond to different land use interventions in agroecosystems. But yeah, it's been a pleasure to delve into these records in the Gosforth Wild Web. And hopefully it's been very exciting, and hopefully you'll also feel a bit excited about my slides. So let's buzz off. It's about the invertebrates. So I thought I'd start off by looking at the leaderboards of all of the recorded organisms in the Gosforth Wild Web. And would you believe it, 7 out of 10 of the most recorded species in the Gosforth Wild Web are invertebrates, in fact. We've got like the harlequin ladybird, the 7-spot, the 2-spot, green shield bugs, cream spot ladybirds, pine ladybirds, and the 10-spot ladybirds. Now, the eagle-eyed people amongst you may be able to spot a pattern, or rather, there's a spotted pattern, but we've got an odd one now, which is the green shield bugs. And I love shield bugs, so it's good that it's up there. But yeah, why are there so many ladybirds recording? And I think it's just a testament to how successful the Northeast ladybird spot has been, as well as all of the ID training that the NHSN offers. And it just goes to highlight that in recording schemes, it's not necessarily what is most prevalent, but it's definitely what people put more attention to. So I looked at how the Gosforth Wild Web compared to the rest of England's recording leaderboard. And it turns out in England, the top 10 recorded species are all butterflies, which are, they're charismatic and gorgeous, obviously, but it just goes to show the differences between each recording scheme. Would you believe it? You've recorded ladybirds 2,032 times as of last week. And I think that's really impressive when you look at it in terms of that's almost 4% of England's ladybird recordings in Gosforth Wild Web. And so the 100 kilometre square size of the Gosforth Wild Web is like 0.008% of England. So for 4% of ladybird recordings to come from this lovely square of land is just incredible. And I just want to highlight a really cool ladybird, the Adonis ladybird. It's quite rare for the Northeast. In fact, if you'd like to read any more about it, James Common did a cool blog post 2 years ago on Common by Nature, where I learned a little bit about it, such as that it's in like dry, sandy habitats. But yeah, I'd really like to plug that. But that's enough about ladybirds. Let's move on to all the other cool invertebrates that you've spotted. So I'd like to start off in the top left with a snakefly, which is neither a snake nor a fly, but I think it gets its name from its very long neck, as you can see, and it belongs to the same order as lacewings. There was one record of this, and it's not because it's rare, but because it's just really under-recorded. And you can find them if you look out for them. They actually inhabit treetops, so they are a little bit difficult and probably why people haven't seen them so much, but they are quite common. But now I'd like to move on to for the notable species. For example, the Tripetozoa, which is a fly which mines leaves, which is just below the snakefly on the left-hand side. And I'm not very good at leaf mines, but for those that don't know, you can tell the species, or you can tend to tell the species of insect which cause the leaf mine by the shape of the leaf mine and by the habit of how it eats the inside of the leaves. So this is, another notable species, as well as the middle species, Curculio-betulae, which is a really cool weevil. And I love weevils because, look at this one. I love its long snout, which is called a rostrum. And if you can't tell from the name, they feast on birch, Betula pendula. And so what they do, the adults eat the leaves, but the larvae actually eat the catkins. And so the adults will burrow into the catkins and then lay their eggs. And I think that's a really cool life history trait, and it explains the long snout. We've also got the hill cuckoo bee, which is gorgeous on the top right. And it looks very similar to the red-tailed bumblebee, but it's a cuckoo bee, which means it's a brood parasite. So what the adult cuckoo bee will do is it'll find a red-tailed bumblebee nest, and it will crawl in and it will kill the queen of the red-tailed bumblebee, and it will take over the nest, start laying its eggs. And so the workers that were the red-tailed bumblebee workers will actually raise the brood. And so it's quite savage, but that's why it gets the name cuckoo. And below that we've got Dolichovespula saxonica, which is also called the Saxon wasp. Now this isn't actually a native species, it's a Mediterranean species, but it's been like working its way slowly up England and Britain, and it's a really cool wasp which is now found here in the northeast, but it is still a notable species. Now to look at Lepidoptera. There are some really cool butterflies and moths out there, but I thought I'd start with the micromoths at the top. Micromoths are also quite underrepresented in recording schemes because they tend to be difficult to identify because they're small and they're not as recognisable as the larger charismatic moths, like the hawk moths, for example. So we've got like the dark fleabane neb and the yellow-barred longhorn, which are both notable species for the northeast. And I love common names because they're so descriptive. So you'll be able to tell that the neb is found feasting on fleabane and that the yellow-barred longhorn has these incredible long horns, if you can't see. And it has a yellow bar, I guess. We've also got the two butterflies below it, the small heath and the wool brown. These are really cool discoveries because they are butterfly conservation high priority species. So to find them up here and keep a track of them is such a really good thing. Obviously, if we're all contributing towards the Gosforth Wild Web and we're spotting these rare and endangered species, it's another great purpose of the recording scheme. Now, talking of tracking species, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the girdled snail. Now, it's not as charismatic as, ringneck parakeets, but it's still just as interesting in terms of how it has moved its way up of Britain. So it was first discovered in Devon in 1950, and it was introduced from the Mediterranean. They think it's because it's brought along with like plant pots, when we bought plants. And it's only 1 centimetre in diameter, so it's quite a small snail, but it's recognisable by its keel along the shell, hence the girdle snail, and it's bright and sharp. Now, on the right-hand side is the NBN map of records, and I've coloured them by decade, and hopefully you'll be able to see a pattern, but if not, I'll overlay some ovals. So it started off being introduced in 1950 in Devon, and in the 1960s, it started to expand its host range. In the 1970s and 80s, there were some, it was under-recorded and some weird patterns, so I'll skip over that. But as of the 90s, it expanded into much of the south of England. Go forwards, should I? 2000s, the 10s, the 20s, and you can see that it's slowly moving up Britain. And you actually managed to find some instances of the girdled snail in the records. And I think that's really interesting that you can track these introduced species just by recording what you see on a day-to-day basis, even if it is crawling up Britain at a snail's pace. Yes, I'd like to thank everybody for listening and hand over to Hollie and Emily.
Okay, hopefully everyone can hear me. So we are Hollie and Emily, and we're the new assistant naturalists here, so we're focusing all of our time on Gosforth Wild Web, engaging schools and communities to notice nature. So we're just going to talk about a few interesting sightings of birds and mammals that we've seen and that you've spotted in the web. So we have a few firsts at Gosforth Nature Reserve, species that have been sighted and that are breeding. So first we have the marsh tit, which has been spotted at Gosforth Nature Reserve. This is one of the first in decades that's been spotted, so it's really great to see that coming back since it's been on the red list for about 2 years, unfortunately. You're probably most likely to see this on its own or in pairs, and they like to stay quite near to their territory. And then we have the little egret with this magnificent picture, one of my personal favourites to see at the reserve. This year we've had the first breeding pair of little egrets at Gosforth Nature Reserve, which is amazing. The first started breeding in the UK in the late 90s, so and we think this is probably one of the first in a long time breeding at Gosforth Nature Reserve, which is great. And a little fact that I came across while looking at these, the sort of neck feathers of the little egret used to be as valuable as gold in the 19th century, so a lot of egrets were smuggled in to Europe, which caused a lot of decline until protection laws were put in place. And then finally, we have the lapwing, which has successfully bred in fields near Gosforth Nature Reserve, which is great, because about 55% of the lapwings have been declining in the UK since the late 60s, due to sort of the loss of mixed farming and intensification of grassland. So it's really good to see that being spotted in and around Gosforth. And next we have the ruddy shelduck, which is very cute, which is why it's got a whole slide dedicated to itself. This was spotted at Killingworth Lake, and it's a migratory bird which spends the winter usually in the Indian subcontinent, but every year a small population of them arrive in the UK in around about August, and these birds stem from feral populations of ruddy shelducks in Europe. So next we have a few species that are increasing and declining within the web. The first is the Chetty's warbler, which was first recorded in the UK in 1961, and they are now spreading more north and becoming more common. So that's great. And we also have the willow tit, which looks very similar to the marsh tit, but lives in slightly different habitats. This is currently Britain's fastest declining bird, and it's been on the red list since 2022 as well. These like to live in younger, damp woodlands compared to the marsh tit, which lives in sort of older woodlands where they can forage easier. And then a few birds on migration. So these are a few birds that you might have seen in the summer and should be heading off now to their migratory routes towards Africa. We have the spotted flycatcher, which was spotted at the Rising Sun Country Park, as well as the other two birds here. This spends about May to October in the UK and then the winter in Africa. Some of these can fly as far south as Namibia, which is a very long way for such a small bird. Then we have the redstart in the middle with its lovely red tail, which is where it gets its name from. These spend about April to October in the UK and then the winter in Trans-Saharan Africa. And then finally we have the windchat, which also spends April to October in the UK. You may see a lot of these in more upland areas, and its name, windchat, winch stems from the word gorse, which obviously you'll see a lot of gorse bushes in the upland, and then chat refers to the sound that it makes. And then finally we have this lovely picture of an Alexandrine parakeet, which I think was possibly spotted in Chris Wren's garden. They are common as pets, but some have been spotted in the web. You might also have seen some ring-necked parakeets around as well, which do look similar. So yes, a lovely bird to leave us and pass on to Emily, who'll be talking about mammals.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Yeah. Lovely. So I'm going to chat quickly about some of the mammals that we've been getting in Gosforth's Wild Web. And if you've not caught on yet, you might realise that most of the recordings we get are plants or fungi or invertebrates, maybe because a plant doesn't run away from you, so you can get a photo of it. And so on the whole, with the recordings that we get in Gosforth's Wild Web, we do get less mammals. But that doesn't mean they're not fun, which are the ones that we do get. So I'm going to start us off with this video. Just before I play it, I'll give you a little bit of a background. So Chris Wren is one of the many, many amazing volunteers that Natural History Society of Northumbria have. Chris Wren sets up a lot of camera traps of small mammals. This is one of the small mammal camera traps he has in his own garden, in which he often gets lots of little fellas running through. This one's quite an exciting one because this is a little water shrew. And Chris Wren puts little mice that he has trapped in his attic. He sometimes puts them under this slate here for stoats and weasels to come in and get. And the purpose of putting it under the bit of slate is just to give the camera trap a second to recognise that there's something in front of it. What he wasn't expecting was this little water shrew to come along. So I'll see if it'll play. Pre-warning, I can't remember how loud the sound is, so if you get blasted, I'm sorry. Not got sound on, it's fine. So you'll be amazed in just a second when it pulls out this mouse, which when you're looking at this little shrew, you might think it looks like the size of a mouse. As soon as this mouse comes out of the slate, it is tiny compared to it. So water shrew are known to carry things much heavier than themselves. They can carry prey up to 60 times their own weight, which is quite phenomenal. So not only carrying the mouse is quite impressive, but getting it under that heavy stone is also impressive. But water shrew, typically, as the name would suggest, like to be near water. Chris Wren's back garden is about 300 metres away from the nearest watercourse. So this water shrew must be making that distance. And if you're only this big, that's quite a distance to make. They're also a very impressive little mammal. Their saliva in their bite has a toxin which will paralyse its prey. So that'll be amphibians and stuff like that. Just a really nifty little adaptation this tiny, quite unassuming little mammal has. Oh, also, should mention, it's not yet confirmed, but this is probably the first ever footage that is being recorded of a water shrew carrying on like that. Oh, it's still playing. Okay, next up, I couldn't not mention the otter. So if you are familiar with Gosforth Nature Reserve, you might know that there are breeding otter there. This is the otter. Now, we have had many sightings of this, all at Gosforth Nature Reserve. That's not to say that there couldn't be more within Gosforth Wild Web, but if you know otter, you know you're not going to see them. I've been going to Gosforth Nature Reserve for 4 years, and I've seen this otter once. I'm not bitter about it at all. It was actually seen this weekend with 2 cubs, so she's definitely there, and if you're lucky enough, you might see her mooching about the reeds and stuff. Oh, and I also included a nice video of the otter. Because if you're going to do mammals, you've got to give videos. Oh, that's not going to play. Nope. Well, I can describe the video. It's this lovely dog otter rolling around in the grass, having the time of its life. We're really fortunate that at Gosforth Nature Reserve we have lots of camera traps set out, and so we do get cracking footage like this. If you want to see footage of a cute otter rolling around in some grass, do check out our YouTube channel, which has lots of videos like that. And finally, I'm just going to mention the rabbit on mammals in the wild web. This year, rabbit sightings have been down quite drastically. That's not something confined to the wild web. That is something that has been noticed countrywide. You may be familiar with rabbit disease called myxomatosis, MIXI. That is still around, but what is really getting them at the moment is, and apologies if I say this incorrectly, rabbit hemophagic disease 2. So it's a new variant of it which causes internal bleeding in the rabbits, and most times it is fatal. As a lot of people have pet rabbits, there are vaccines that exist for it. I'm not sure if they've vaccinated for the second variation of it yet, but there are vaccines for the first. However, obviously, no one's going around vaccinating wild rabbits. And so, unfortunately, a lot have suffered from this disease this year. If you've ever seen a poorly rabbit on the side of the road, typically their eyes start looking a bit cloudy and they just start really lethargic type of behaviours. As the rabbit population is quite substantial in England, it's too early to say how much of an effect this disease is going to have on their populations. And that is everything to do with mammals in the wild web. There are a few other recordings. One of my favourites, which made me chuckle, was the domestic house cat, spotted a handful of times in the wild web, which at first I chuckled at, but the domestic house cat most certainly does have a knock-on effect to its local wildlife, and so it is important when recording wildlife that you don't forget your pets and what effect that they're going to have on the outside world. And so, to finish us off, James is coming back out, and he's going to talk to us about urban plants.
So Emily and Hollie hit the nail on the head when it comes to plants. They're stationary, they don't run away, which is absolutely fabulous for some of us of the more portly persuasion who can potter about and look at them with leisure. And you've done an amazing job botanising across Gosforth's Wild Web. I think we're somewhere in the region now of about 12,000 plant sightings and around about 900 species, which when you consider the British flora is around about 6,000, is a fair old chunk. And what's really intriguing is a lot of these plants are living in habitats where you wouldn't quite expect them. Oh, this animation again. So, we all like rare and scarce plants. They're the things that make us excited when we stumble across them whilst out and about. And as part of Wild Web, you've done an incredible job finding some of these plants that botanists have been looking for quite a long time. All of the plants here and around about 30 other species recorded so far feature on a document called the Rare Plant Register for South Northumberland, which is a creation by local botanists to track the decline of these species, and is available online if you'd like to look. But we have to start with an orchid. And in terms of the local area, perhaps our most special, should I say, is June helleborine. This is quite a scarce plant nationally. Well, it's very rare nationally, actually. May or may not be the same subspecies, or same species, apologies, as the Lindisfarne helleborine, but I won't open that can of worms today. But what is important is that this plant does well at sites further up the Tyne. It's a metallophyte. It grows on land polluted by heavy metals. So if you get towards an old lead works near Haltwhistle or Hayden Bridge, it can be quite common. In Newcastle, it's rather a different story. And since the 1970s, it has been known only from a small part of Newburn down on the Tyne. But that changed last year when, rather surprisingly, a population was found at Rising Sun Country Park. So that's North Tyneside. That's a completely different area and quite the jump for a supposedly rare species. Again, an industrial site, but quite exciting, and just goes to show that some of these rarities can actually move around. A little bit more pretty, dare I say, is pyramidal orchid. Now, if you go to Northumberland or parts of County Durham, this is a very, very common species of any calcareous habitat. It loves sand dunes and chalky grasslands. We don't have very much of that in Tyneside, so historically it's been restricted to the coast. But what's been really nice to see is you've been recording it from several sites inland, Silverlink, Walker and other industrial sites where surely lime and other calcareous materials have been added to the soil. So if this keeps up, pyramidal orchid might just become a common urban orchid in Newcastle. We'll see next year. And not an orchid, but just as pretty, I hope you agree, we have clustered bellflower here, and like June helleborine, this is one you usually find right up in the interior of Northumberland. So if I told you then that the city's only population grows on the site of a former tar works at Walker, you might be quite surprised, but that is certainly the case, and down there at Walker Riverside there's a thriving population of these, and they really are worth going to see in June and July. I was about to say this is more exciting, but really it's a fern, it's a bit green. So here we have rustyback, and again, this is another terribly rare species in the northeast. Not the case in the south and west of the UK. Down there, it's a perfectly common plant of mortared walls. Like a few other ferns, it likes the calcium in mortar. But up here, it's a bit of a different story. And for the longest time in Tyneside, the only known population of this plant was on someone's garden wall in North Shields. And that garden wall has been visited since at least 2000 by at least, I worked out, 30 botanists. So that homeowner must be quite grateful that someone else has now gone and founded Brunswick, not far from Big Waters. But if the trend observed outside of Wild Web in Northumberland is anything to go by, this fern is becoming a lot more common. And if any of you have a ferny wall in your neighbourhood, it really is checking. I'm sure many more of you will find it. Here we have gypsywort, a lovely little plant with white whorls of flowers and really distinctive serrated leaves. It is a riparian plant. It grows around the margins of pools, and elsewhere in the UK it's a very abundant species. Here, again, not so. It was recorded for the first time in the 1800s by Nathaniel Winch at the Eusebourne, which was the first county record of this plant, but since then there were only about a dozen records until the turn of the millennium, when all of a sudden it exploded. And as part of Wild Web so far, you've now recorded it from just about every wetland in Newcastle and North Tyneside, showing that sometimes the botanists get it wrong, and actually this plant isn't all that rare at all, which is a good news story, I guess. But if you've got a pond in your area, do have a look for it. And as far as surprises go, this one was a real shocker. So this is early dog violet. It's the rare and elusive cousin of the common dog violet so many of us see on our woodland walks in spring. And historically in our area, this plant was confined to 2 woodlands right off in inland Northumberland, where it was only recorded about 6 times in the last century. Well, you can imagine the surprise then when it turned up growing beside a path, again at Rising Sun Country Park. I'm not entirely sure what's going on there with all these notable plants, actually. It's since been found growing on footpaths at Silverlink and may have been confirmed from Havana Nature Reserve again, which is a far cry from the textbook definition of an ancient woodland plant. But whether it came from someone's rockery or off of a botanist's boot, it is a good story, and I suspect we'll see a lot more of this to come. So a few of the speakers tonight have talked about how your sightings are tracking changes, and nowhere is this more apparent than in our plants. So we have 3 nice examples here. Over on that side we have Oxford ragwort, which is taught in GCSE geography as the sort of stereotypical example of a successful non-native species. It is native to Sicily, and it was collected by botanists from Oxford Botanic Garden in 1690, I believe, and taken back to the garden as a curiosity, where a few decades later it had moved to the wall of the estate, and a few decades after that it had reached the railway lines. Well, if you've ever seen the material that goes along our railways, it's very similar to a volcanic ash field, and this plant promptly colonised the whole of the UK, reaching at the far north of Scotland along railways. It's still a relatively new arrival in our region, but your sightings really are showing that this is now one of the commonest and most abundant urban plants in gardens, walls, patios, just about everywhere. In the middle here, we have narrow-leaved ragwort, which arrived in our region only in the last few decades, but is showing signs now of following in the footsteps of Oxford ragwort. It arrived first at ports in Tyneside, so it was most frequent along the Tyne, where it supposedly arrived as a wool shoddy alien, so the seeds fell off wool coats imported from South Africa. And the records agree with that. For the longest time it was found at Elswick, Walker, St Peter's and the Royal Quays area near North Shields, but was reluctant to move. Not the case now, and it's now merrily growing in Newcastle city centre and making a break for the suburbs too. So who knows, in 5 years' time it might be just as common as the other one we talked about. Now, what to say about Guernsey fleabane? You will never see a more boring plant. If I told you it was a member of the daisy family, you might even question me on that because it looks nothing like a daisy. I've got nothing complimentary to say about it whatsoever. It's hairy. But Guernsey fleabane is interesting in that with a name like Guernsey, you might think it came from Guernsey. That's not the case at all. Its Latin name, Erigeron sumatrensis, might point to Sumatra, but that's another fib. It's actually from Chile in Argentina, so I think Linnaeus had a bit of an off day when he was naming that one. But like narrow-leaved ragwort, it arrived as a wool-shoddy alien around ports, and for the longest time had a pocket of sort of population in Newcastle city centre, but really you're showing this now exploding rapidly in Gosforth's wild web. But they're all sort of old introductions, but just to illustrate that new introductions are happening every single day based on what we all grow in our gardens. This one is Chinese barberry, a really spiny but quite beautiful plant that is popular in hedging and parkland schemes. For the longest time, that was kind of where it was. It was planted. It didn't grow out in the wild. But as you might gather, with many of these alien shrubs, their berries are very tasty to birds. And this one is now spreading. You found populations at Hebburn, the one square of County Durham in Gosforth's wild web. You found it at Elswick and in Jesmond-Dean. And following on from privet and a few of the other common garden plants, this one will certainly become more common. I couldn't find a better picture, I'm sorry. If anyone is out there this next week, please take a better photo of this grass for me. But waterbent, it's not the most exciting thing to look at, but it has a fascinating story in that it's a South European species that was first recorded from the Channel Islands in southern England about 150 years ago. And that's where it lived. It lived in the south. But something has happened in the last few decades whereby this plant has now spread north as far as Edinburgh, because it's found a niche in habitats where so few plants grow, in pavement, in wall bases, in the cracks in your driveway. And whilst it's not common in Newcastle, in just over 2 years it has more than trebled its range in the city, and your sightings really are showing that annually this plant is taking over the place. And if you were to go and look for it now, it's just about the only grass still in flower in pavements. So I guarantee that tomorrow, if you look down your street, you might well find this one. Hopefully a bit prettier than the grass, but we had to talk about bee orchids, and this is a bit of a good news story, really. Well, not good news when you consider it's spread up here with the aid of climate change, but we'll look on the positive side. Bee orchid was always a plant of southern downlands where it grows on chalky soil, but over the last few decades has spread north rapidly. And in Newcastle, it seems to have found a real niche, again, on former industrial plots, with huge aggregations of bee orchids along Scotswood Road, in Elswick, Silverlink, quite near to the cinema there, if anyone is popping down. But it's also turning up in some very odd places too. And last year, someone actually found one just over there on the lawn of Newcastle Civic Centre, which a week later, when we got very excited and went to see it, had been mown to smithereens. But at least it tried. And this is actually becoming one of our commonest urban orchids. And it's probably the one we get the most sightings of from urban areas as part of the project. So let's go over these really, really quickly. But not all introductions occurred in the last few decades. Some are far older, and archaeophyte is a horrible word. You don't need to remember it, but effectively it means an introduction that took place in the Bronze Age. It is a non-native species that has been adopted as an honorary native. And so far you've recorded around about 50 of these old introductions within the web. And it's quite interesting to note how their niches have changed since faraway times. Ellie Campaign with the lovely daisy-like flower over there. Quite a terrifying plant if you see it up close. Actually, it can get to about 6 foot tall. There's a lovely one growing on the verge just outside of Gosforth Nature Reserve at the minute, actually. It was an old apothecary's plant introduced to help with respiratory conditions. And of course, escape gardens. It's remained rare since, but it is out there, and you've been recording it from Lisa's, Havana, and a few other local sites. Field pansy. Now, I didn't know until I googled this that it used to get a very, very bad rep, in that it was one of the most problematic arable weeds in the UK, so much so that some modern herbicides were developed just to kill field pansy. Well, they succeeded because it's quite rare now as an arable plant, but what it has done is find a niche in the disturbed land of our towns and cities. And if you think just about everything we do in towns and cities is digging or moving something, meaning plenty of scope for this little plant to colonise. And black horehound here, not too much to say about it. You've spotted it around about 25 times, but interestingly, this plant is declining rapidly in Scotland. It doesn't seem to be doing that in the northeast, so perhaps that's a bit of a challenge for botanists to work out in the future. And finally, just evidence that new things are getting out all the time. Once again, it's a case of look after your bulbs. There are various ways that plants get out into the countryside, into our parks and green spaces, one of the most common are garden escapes. And two of the ones which have been recorded as part of the project so far that were a tad more surprising are Italian lords and ladies and green snowdrop. Now, green snowdrop's quite interesting in that it's sort of the bigger, burlier cousin of the common snowdrop, so many of us know and love. It has bigger green leaves for one versus the blue ones of the common sort. And clearly these ones have been lobbed across a fence. And so often you find it growing at the backs of gardens where they back onto parks or green spaces. But it can spread quite rapidly, and it is doing so in Jesmond and at Havana Nature Reserve. Some of the others arrive via different means, but this one illustrates carefully, probably perfectly, just how careful we have to be. Egyptian clover, this was found on a field margin at Dudley during an NHSN field trip earlier this year. It was the first Northumberland record of this African plant, and we think it arrived as a contaminant of grain planted in the fields. But there are quite literally hundreds of plants which Dudley, Egypt, can't really see a difference myself, but go and see it. So be glad to know that's it for the plants, but all of this, all of the wildlife sightings you've heard about today, none of it would be possible without your support, without you taking part, and without your keen eyes whilst wandering around in the city. But of course, we're never done. 30,000 records is brilliant, but we'd love it if more people were to get involved. And there are several ways you can do so. You can join on iRecord and iNaturalist, submitting to the Wild Web project, both of which are wonderful because you can actually spy on what your neighbours and colleagues have been finding and run down to see the rare mushroom at the bottom of the street. Or simply email us or use the form on our website. We'd really love to hear from you. If you want to dig a little bit deeper into things, you can help fill the gaps on the map. Now, don't be fooled by the lack of gaps on that map. Each one of these blue spots could be one record or 1,000. And within each of those squares, there are plenty of places that haven't been explored. New alleys, parks and roadsides worth a look. You could adopt a patch, you could adopt a park or green space and watch how the wildlife changes there through the seasons. And if you really want to, you could lead a walk in your community, getting your friends and neighbours out there to notice what is around. And I mentioned right at the start that there are more creative ways to support Gosforth's Wild Web to join in. Bearing in mind that not all of us want to spend our time glued to an app recording wildlife. And one of the ways we're asking people to do that is creating A to Zs. Now, these are an amazing tool for highlighting wildlife that transcend ages, whether you're 6 or 60, everybody loves an A to Z. And we're encouraging people to send these in any different way. So far we've had photographic A to Zs, we've had digital submissions, we've had sketchbooks and journals. But you could knit, sew, make one out of bunting. If anyone's a welder, we'd love to see a steelwork A to Z actually. Knock yourselves out. But we will be doing an exhibition of A to Zs associated with wildlife in Gosforth's Wild Web next year in the Field Studies Room at the Gosforth Nature Reserve. And even if you don't send one in, we'd love you to come along and see them. And yeah, just a massive thank you, I'll say it again, for taking part, for supporting the project so far, and I very much hope some of you will consider getting involved during the final year of the project. Thank you.